Hello again, fellow Soulsborne players. Infernal here, and as we're in the wake of the Elden Ring DLC, I wanted to talk about and give my personal ranking for the starting areas in Soulsborne games. To clarify, by starting areas I mean the first proper areas in the games. The level that comes after the tutorials that give you the messages for controller inputs and gameplay tips. What I mean is the part where the game really begins, where the game throws you to the proverbial wolves and has you figure out how to survive. The tutorial gives you some study material, and the starting area is the first test, where, in my opinion, the player actually learns how to play the game. As with my other Soulsborne lists, this again is entirely my opinion, and is a ranking of how effective each area was for personally getting me acquainted with each game's mechanics and atmosphere. As such, it's not at all an indicator of how I would rank the games as a whole, but I thought this would be a fun idea to explore. With that, let's get to it. I absolutely love Sekiro, as previous videos would indicate, but I have to put the first proper level, Ashina Reservoir, on the bottom of this list. I feel that Sekiro is a game that above the others on this list hits a point where it just clicks, where the player finally commits the deflection mechanics to muscle memory. My first time through, it wasn't until the Genichiro fight, about halfway through the game, where it started clicking for me, and nothing in the Ashina Reservoir really hit that eureka moment for me. Obviously, going back to the area on subsequent playthroughs made it much easier once I had learned what the game was trying to teach me. The first time through, I was mostly running and swinging through as fast as possible, fighting mini-bosses like the Ogre that have different mechanics than the rest of the bosses in the game. The snake dodging set piece is cool to see, but is basically not repeated again for the entire game, at least not in the way shown at the beginning. Not a bad level, I just feel like it's not really showing the player what Sekiro is all about. I've said this previously, but while I feel like I love Dark Souls 3, it doesn't really get cooking until about halfway through, when you step out of the catacombs into Irithyll. I do think Eodex Skundir is a fantastic tutorial boss, as he literally judges if the player is worthy to proceed, but if I'm being consistent with true starting areas, it would have to be the High Wall of Lothric. While I like the area as a visual set piece, I actually think the Undead Settlement level that comes after is a little bit better of a place to show the mechanics of the game, especially in terms of dealing with enemy ambushes. As with Ashina Reservoir and Sekiro, this area isn't inherently bad, I just don't feel the layout and placement taught me as much about the game as later levels did. A lot of my decision in this ranking stems from how I felt about the areas when I first played the games, and the High Wall just doesn't give me the same impressions as other Soulsborne areas. While Dark Souls 2 has a couple of branching paths to go through after reaching Majula, Forest of the Fallen Giants is clearly the intended first path, so I'm going with that. I'm not as much of a fan of the area visually, especially contrasted against places like Majula and Heidi's Tower, but I think the forest is actually a pretty solid starting area. Dark Souls 2 had mechanics that differed in several ways from 1 and 3, and the level does manage to show much of them. There's a bonfire shortcut hidden behind a breakable wall that is a mechanic repeated in the game, a room where Pharos Lockstone is needed, and plenty of ambushes, all of which gives the player a taste of things to come. I also like the multiple ways to go, where the player can take out the pursuer earlier to speed over to the Lost Bastille, and skip over No Man's Wharf entirely if they choose. Dark Souls 2 stands out in many ways, and I think the forest is a strong area to give the player starting out. I was debating putting the first intended legacy dungeon, Stormveil Castle, here, but in my opinion the starting area of Elden Ring is when you step out of the cave into the Limgrave field. I'm someone who generally isn't a fan of open worlds, as I find them a bit overwhelming, but Limgrave does a good job of showing the player what Elden Ring is all about. It tempts the player with a few enemies, and then gives them a too hot, don't touch moment where they can get absolutely wrecked if they're not prepared. The game guides players to an intended path, but also encourages exploration and leveling, so they're never really stuck behind a wall. There's no denying the art direction is fantastic either, and it's a treat to be able to come back in and still discover things I missed my first, second, or even third time through. Boletaria Palace, or level 1-1 in Demon Souls, is the first proper level after the tutorial demon fight, and I think it's an excellent way to introduce nearly everything the game has to offer in one space. The atmosphere is simultaneously beautiful and oppressive, and the level showcases the vertical design, shortcuts, and hidden NPCs that later Soulsborne games would be known for. In my opinion, it's an extremely important level in the evolution of Souls games, and one that set important groundwork in the design of later FromSoft titles. I also couldn't help but notice design similarities when playing through the Stormveil Legacy dungeon in Elden Ring. If it wasn't for the final area on this list, I'd call Undead Burg just about perfect as a starting area. Actually, I think it is perfect for what it sets out to do for the player, namely teaching them the mechanics of Dark Souls in one brilliantly designed area. The place has some excellent visual storytelling, using actions instead of exposition, which has become a FromSoft staple. One of the biggest reasons I love Undead Burg, and Dark Souls 1 as a whole, is because of the interconnected world. Finding out ways to loop and link all the way back to Firelink Shrine was an absolute thrill to me when I discovered it, and I find myself wishing we had gotten that more in subsequent games. And here it is. This area is, in my opinion, as close to perfect of a starting area as I could imagine. I suppose it's not a coincidence that my favorite FromSoft game also has my favorite starting location, but I think it's just that good. I struggled a lot with this level when I first played, but I feel like it made me all the better at the game as a result. It really teaches you everything you need to know about the game, managing groups of enemies, baiting out harder enemies, unlocking shortcuts that connect to a central hub, and, well, how to survive the madness. Every time I step into Yharnam again, it makes me yearn for more of the world of Bloodborne. The level is topped off by Father Gascoigne, whom I incidentally consider the best tutorial boss in all of Soulsborne. He teaches you how to deal with both hunter-type bosses and beast-type bosses, how to dodge effectively, and the effectiveness of visceral attacks. Oh yeah, and his intro is absolutely fantastic. So that's how I would currently rank all the Soulsborne starting areas. I know there's probably some debate as to what actually constitutes a starting location in these games, but I tried to define what that means to me personally. As always, I'm interested in hearing your takes on these areas, and maybe how you'd rank them. In the future, I'd love to do a tier list of Soulsborne games in general, especially in the wake of the Shadows of the Erdtree DLC. Stay tuned. Thank you for any and all support on my channel. I'm still slowly getting going, but I really enjoy talking about my favorite video games. I'm on Patreon at patreon.com/theinfernalrealm, and I stream Soulsborne games, big surprise, and also horror, JRPGs, and retro over on Twitch as An Infernal One. Thanks again.